Medea was familiar with plagues. They were surrounded by episodes of bubonic plague as well as other types of plagues, which infect good works and interfere with the action of divine grace on the living out of our lives. And so, and we know, this is more or less common sense, but it also deals with the idea of what discernment we apply. How much self-knowledge do I have? It takes a lot of self-knowledge to be truly discerning. One time I went to Libya. I was making a big decision, so I had everything all lined up. I had thought it through very carefully. I went to Libya here and I asked her if I could read her, my discernment. So I read it. She sat there and she looked at me. And pretty soon she said, "Sounds like you just blew that off the top of your head." I spent days on it. But number 9, came to roost right there in front of me. Vanity, self-complacency, and a lack of attention to grace. I don't know if it was infidelity to grace, but it was sure blindness to it. So, to know ourselves, and as I said earlier, the deeper we go into the journey of faith, the more we understand our own motives. And that is a very purifying experience. Mary?
Marcia, I love the way you're talking about this, but I think sometimes the language can get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
Shun always with repulsion.
Repulsion, I know it.
Total mistrust of self.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty strong, if not nearly violent language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So do we just smooth that over?
Well, what I keep saying is that what he does on the one hand, what he undoes on the other hand, And it's like, I think he probably is of a passionate nature, and he's dealing in tough times. It was a violent culture, and it was driven to extremes. And so, he speaks in extremes from time to time, but he always mitigates it. He always mitigates it, and he unsays it. He unsays it, and so that's what we watch for. And these maxims that we're dealing with right here too, it's like this is at the deepest reality of self-knowledge. Like if you read the mystics, the further into the journey they get, the more extreme their language gets, until they are speaking of themselves as nothing. When, as a matter of fact, people are viewing them as something, somebody. But to come to the limits of, the motives that drive us, most of the time we're really unconscious of what moves us. Try to have a pure motive once. Go ahead, do it. That no matter how much largesse a person you have, by Jove, there's going to be some little thing that sticks its head up there that says, wow, this was neat. And we need to be self-confident. We absolutely have to have self-confidence. But we also have to have an awful lot of self-knowledge. And now this goes against all the psychology you can muster up, That's the trouble here. So we're not talking about psychology necessarily. We're talking about the depths of the human experience in God. one book to read is that book by C.S. Lewis. I put it in your resources, Till We Have Faces. That is a perfect example of what I'm trying to say here. And Lewis says it much better than I do. But, you know, it's the story of this woman who writes out her complaints to God, to the God. And she goes on and on for a lifetime of writing, and she's got this gigantic scroll. And she can hardly wait to meet the God so she can issue her complaint. Because she's going to tell, it's a protest, you know, of how she has been misinterpreted her whole life, and she's the queen of some place. You know. So anyway, she gets there and she unrolls her scroll and she starts to read, and the words disappear. You know, and she realizes that everything she has thought herself to be has been, in fact, nothing. And so she goes through this whole thing, and when she finally drops her head in shame and sees herself in the feet of the God, reflected in the feet of the God, she's the most beautiful person in the world. You know? So it's that nothing something that is always present in us. You know? And the more the person is a saint, it seems, the more they become aware of that nothing. And as Marguerite Porete says, you know, she sees neither herself nor God. And that's where faith comes in. We live in the belief that God sees us as in knowing us into existence from day to day. And that's, I think that's where Madai is trying to go here. Because union with God, unioning love with God and all others, that's not a mechanical operation. You know, it requires a total emptiness of self, egoic self. And we cling to the ego. The ego clings to us, you know. It's not going to go anywhere easily. Okay, let's look at Douceur, Finding God in All Things, which does takes us back to Maxim 93, I think. Okay, and also take out that paper that I gave you yesterday on the mystical life. If you have that handy. Okay, Maxim 93 says, we're talking about Douceur, the design, the beauty, and I want to couple that with number 8 on your list, Finding God in All Things, the Mystical Life. Okay, Madai says, for the 3 faculties of your soul desire this perfection. For the memory, to forget things in self in order to remember the one thing necessary, God. For the intellect, to see God in all things, God's glory, God's will, and God's contentment. And for the will, the one freedom to go to God, to love God, to embrace all the dictates of God's providence with all the love of your heart. So he's got here a little paradigm for the examen of consciousness, that what we want to remember, what we want to engage or direct all of our faculties to is, what is God's desire in this? In this particular experience, what does God desire? Does everybody have one of those mystic life sheets? If you don't, I have an extra one here. good. All right, so to direct all of our faculties toward that, and to remember, yesterday, Julie, you were talking about re-member, to put the event or the circumstance, the encounter, back together again in a way that enables us to understand how God is present, or God was present if we're dealing in retrospect. Okay, up here at the top of this paper, on the mystical life, they say that Bernard McGinn describes the mystical life. I hope I gave him, yeah, I did. I gave him credit down at the bottom of the page. He says in the mystical life is, a little paradigm for it is anticipating or preparing for God's immediacy in your life, experiencing God directly, recognizing it when it happens, and then responding to it. But to live a life that is constantly anticipatory of finding God, seeing God, experiencing God, and then knowing it when it happens and responding to it. That's what we're doing in Maxim 93. It's what we are doing when we say that prayer, the state of the heart. You know, you talk about a way in which an event elicited from you a recognition of God. And I dare say, in the response, you generated an anticipation of experiencing again, you know, so that it moves full circle. So the state of the heart enables us to live a mystical life. That's what it's for in the first place. A discerning life, but a mystical life. And becoming fully human. We don't want to put too fine a point on it. Then the idea of glory. I do want to spend a little bit of time on that. Glory in this sense is bringing to life, incarnating God in the moment. And so for the Ignatian, in the Ignatian tradition, the Jesuits have a mysticism of service, which is the service of glory, greater glory of God. And so they're wanting to incarnate God in ever greater dimensions. And Madai has, in the Maxims, there are 13 Maxims with the word glory in it. And so it's like illuminating God. So in Maxim 73, for example, when you have that, live out your whole life with one desire only, to be what God wants you to be in nature, whether it's your God-given talents, grace, what we add in response and fidelity to grace, and glory, how we incarnate the God life around us.
How we incarnate the God life around us.
Through our mysticism of relationships. And if you remember, we give that turn of phrase, we give credit for that turn of phrase to Betty Mosslander here. She realized the distinction between the mysticism of service in the Ignatian stream and how Madai adapted that as a mysticism of relationship in our tradition. You know, and it could just speak of his sensitivity to the way women operated. Who knows? Could have been a part of his own mysticism. Could have been what he saw in the women. So keep that in mind as we're looking through the Maxims.